Même si on voit le résultat, que c'est 50 ans plus tard pour la définition, comme souvent, il y a je peux le mettre sur une clé USB.
Dopo vediamo una pausa pranzo perché adesso non siamo riusciti.
Lui ha anche questo, ma l'ho stampato, quindi... Ma sono problemi?
Sì, per condividere le slide sì, quindi dopo vediamo un'altra pausa pranzo se riusciamo, altrimenti si mette qua la telecamera.
Serve la telecamera di Giovanni?
Sempre duplicata. Non si parte se no. Ok. Ha avviato da solo, ok.
Già partita, sì. La telecamera è quella, quindi questo computer lo fai dopo.
Sì.
Il microfono
L'unica
quale sta
cosa è
usando?
che è collegato con quella telecamera, quindi non si può allontanare.
Il microfono quale sta usando?
Del computer.
Senti, bene.
Ah, questo qua è il volume praticamente.
Da qua si sente bene. Va bene così.
Se c'è qualche...
Questo perché no, allora questo complicato. Allora, buongiorno a tutti. Iniziamo con tempore, con qualche minuto. Iniziamo con qualche minuto di ritardo questa terza giornata del ciclo di seminari su luoghi e spazi della medicina antica e oggi abbiamo tre ospiti, tre relatori che ringraziamo, che sono tutti e tre in qualche modo specialisti sia dell'antico che del tardo antico, da prospettive diverse, da punti di vista diversi, e quindi sarà molto interessante ascoltare da queste diverse prospettive l'indagine sul ruolo della medicina, del medico, degli spazi medici nella città, nella letteratura e così via. Cominciamo con Therese Führer, che attualmente è all'università, è ordinaria di latinistica alla Università di Monaco in Germania, Monaco di Baviera in Germania. Therese ha studiato in Svizzera, ha insegnato poi alle università di Trier, di Zurigo, di Berlino lungamente e poi dal 2013, se non sbaglio, a Monaco di Baviera. È una specialista in realtà ha cominciato dal mondo greco, da Callimaco, quindi dalla letteratura ellenistica, e per poi spostarsi sempre più sul mondo latino, anche sulla filosofia e sull'antico e sul tardo antico, arrivando in particolare poi ad Agostino, che rappresenta uno dei suoi autori più importanti. C'è una importante monografia su Agostino uscita 20 anni fa forse, Augustinus.
Sì, ma è rinnovata.
Adesso esatto, una nuova edizione uscita l'anno scorso per la Wissenschaftliche Buchgesellschaft, che ai noi adesso ha dichiarato fallimento, di BBG.
Sì, purtroppo.
Che purtroppo ha dichiarato fallimento recentemente, e quindi vedremo che cosa succederà. Oltre ad Agostino, appunto, Terese ha pubblicato anche un volume anche abbastanza recente insieme con Martin Hose sul dramma antico, Das antike Drama, e molti articoli. È redattrice del Real Lexicon für Antiken Christentum, ha collaborato con la Neue Pauli, con tante iniziative enciclopediche. Adesso non sto qui a dire tutti i dettagli della sua lunga e fruttuosa attività. È stata condirettrice della rivista Philologus, eccetera. Quindi lascio a lei la parola, e oggi ci parla dei medici alla corte di Tiberio, il modo in cui Tacito rappresenta il loro ruolo a Roma come teatro del potere. Prego, Teresa.
Grazie. Allora, posso
Sì, certo.
fare così?
Sì.
Grazie per l'invitazione, grazie a Ambra, grazie a Lorenzo e Daniela e tutti gli altri e le altre. Mi scuso, adesso parlo l'inglese. In the question of the luoghi e spazi della medicina antica, I will concentrate on the space of power at the Roman imperial court, on the question of the role of physicians at the court of the Julio-Claudian emperors, narrowed down to the depiction in Tacitus' Annales with a focus on Tiberius. By space of power, I mean the field in which the negotiations, the intrigues and battles for power are fought out. The physicians working at court certainly do not play a central role here, as their social position as peregrines, mostly slaves, freedmen, freeborns, some with Roman citizenship, prevents them from holding political office. In the Roman theatre of power, as the title in my article, however, they can be instrumentalized by various actors for their own purposes, thanks to their specific skills and licenses, and so they also get to play their part in that theatre, small but also decisive supporting roles for the dramatic plot. As I'm not a medical historian but a literary scholar, my paper will focus on the luoghi e spazi in which Tacitus has the physicians appear, on the question in which social spaces they appear, in which concrete material spaces, and in particular in which areas of the imperial court, in whose physical proximity, spatial proximity, with which members of the imperial family, and also in which topographically identifiable places the physicians are active. Since Tacitus's plot of the Roman theatre of power is not fully comprehensible in every respect without a certain knowledge of cultural and social history, I will begin with a few remarks on the importance and role of physicians at the Julio-Claudian imperial court, especially in Tiberius's environment. The prosopographical and medical historical information relevant for understanding the Tacitian passage will follow in the course of my textual analyses. The physicians who were employed at the Roman imperial court were among the highest ranking of their profession. They moved in close contact with members of the imperial family and had access to intimate data about their patrons, on the basis of which they were able to make an individual diagnosis and or prognosis. A doctor has access to the patient's body, which he has to know and therefore touch in order to apply his art, i.e. to be able to make statements about the patient's physical condition. This physical proximity is expressed by the German term Leibarzt, medico personale, who, in contrast to the occasional Wundarzt, wound doctor, is responsible for the well-being of his patient and is obliged to be available to him at all times. Ancient personal physicians enjoyed a position of trust that often went far beyond the medical care of the higher-ranking patient. A physician at the Roman imperial court therefore not only had access to the body, but subsequently also to the inner rooms of the members of the imperial family, be it specific chambers or, in a figurative sense, the physical privacy of a person. Therefore, even as a socially inferior person, his expertise gave him a certain kind of power over the imperial patient, who placed his or her trust, the artis fides, in the physician. Just as often as successful treatments, the ancient texts speak of the abuse of this trust, of misdiagnoses, incorrect treatments, sexual assaults, mostly on female patients, or illicit affairs, but also of intentional malpractice and abuse of medical knowledge, the administration of harmful drugs, poison, or interventions on and in the body of the healthy or sick patient. The position of power that the doctor has over a patient, thanks to his expertise and his proximity, can also be exploited by his employer or by others. The doctor can become an easily concealed, effective instrument of intrigue and assassination if he makes his expertise available to his employer to the detriment of others, or conversely, if he sells his license to access his employer's body to another. Let us now have a closer look at the physicians in the environment of Tiberius. Educated in the broad spectrum of Hellenistic sciences and with a wide range of interests, Tiberius seems to have surrounded himself with intellectual companions from a young age in Rhodes and later in Capri. However, we have no knowledge of a personal physician in his entourage. Rather, according to Plutarch, Suetonius, and Tacitus, he explicitly rejected the services of physicians. And that's item 2 on your handout. I hope everybody has one. Plutarch twice refers to Tiberius' statement that it was ridiculous, katagelastos, for a man over 60 years of age to hold out his hand to the physician, prosteinon iatrocheira, which Plutarch rejects as an argument. Suetonius formulates Tiberius' dictum as a general negative attitude towards the help and advice of physicians, adjumentum consilium. Tacitus, and that's now item number 1, comments most extensively on the emperor's attitude and derision, eludere, towards the medicorum artes and those people who, in adulthood, after the age of 30, were dependent on others to deal with their bodies. That's solitosque eludere Tiberius eos qui postricesimum etatis annum ad internoscenda corpori suo utilia vel noxia alieni concili indigerent. With this remark, Tacitus concludes the account of the increasing influence of Gaius Caesar, that's Caligula, hereafter Caligula, who imposed himself on the succession to the throne in the year 37, the year of Tiberius' death. Tiberius had felt unable to make a decision due to mental and physical exhaustion. That's paragraph 3, not on the handout. Incertus animi fesso corpore, and had left that decision to fate. With his commentary at the beginning of paragraph 5 on the handout on Tiberius' persistence in his dissolute lifestyle and pretense of strength, sed gravescente valetudine nihil libidinibus a libidinibus omitebat. Tacitus with this commentary, he anticipates his description of the death scene, where Tiberius actually resists a physician's diagnosis. I'll come to that later. Let me first add some more information relevant to the history of medicine, of ancient medicine. Tiberius' skepticism towards physicians was not entirely consistent, as can be concluded from a series of testimonies. His younger contemporary Scribonius Largus tells us that the slave named Atimetus, so Scribonius tells us that the slave named Atimetus told him, Scribonius, that he had prepared a remedy for colic, a colicae, for Tiberius. A remedy invented by the physician Cassius, to whom Tiberius later bequeathed that slave Atimetus. And Atimetus dictated the recipe to Scribonius, who edited a collection of remedies. But still, there is no direct contact between the physician, Cassius, and the emperor. Scribonius also reports that before his death, the physician Paccius from Antioch, a Greek physician too, dedicated and sent to the Emperor Tiberius a document containing the secret recipe for the medicine for lateral pain, lateris dolor, which Tiberius thereafter made available to a wider audience in the public libraries. It is also worth mentioning that Celsus wrote his Artes, of which the 8 books De Medicina have survived during the reign of Tiberius, who was fundamentally conducive to science. One more testimony should be mentioned. We learn from Velleius Paterculus, the officer who accompanied Tiberius in his army for many years, that the emperor had physicians on his staff when he was out in the field, because, as Velleius says from personal experience, Tiberius was very concerned about the health of his soldiers. Here, too, it is clear that Tiberius was not fundamentally opposed to physicians and their art, but again, there is no mention of an imperial personal physician. 2 physicians who worked at court under Tiberius' regime have achieved dubious fame: Eudemus and Charicles. As they were given special prominence in the Tiberius books of Tacitus, Annales, through a relatively brief mention in each case, I will now examine the question of what role Tacitus ascribes to them in these 2 passages. I begin with Eudemus. Eudemus is known to have made observations on rabies as a methodologist and advised on certain treatments. He had a close personal relationship with his patron Livia or Livilla Julia, wife of the younger Drusus and thus daughter-in-law of Tiberius. According to the older Pliny, Eudemus was one of those physicians who were involved in adultery with members of the imperial family. Tacitus's commentary on the role of Eudemus in his dealings with Livia Julia is embedded in the description of the power plays of Sejanus, the prefect of the imperial guard, whom Tacitus briefly introduces at the beginning of the 4th book and thus the year 23. In order to exploit Tiberius's weakness and take over rule himself, he intrigues against potential crown princes in the imperial family, above all Tiberius's son, the younger Drusus. The first thing Sejanus did to eliminate Drusus was to approach his wife Livia, whom he seduced and to whom he promised marriage and a share in imperial power after the murder of her husband. As Tacitus points out, and that's in book 4, chapter 3, paragraph 4, and that's item number 3 on the handout. Livia was a granddaughter of Augustus, daughter-in-law of Tiberius, and mother of sons from her marriage to Drusus, therefore mother of grandsons of the emperor. So she had enormous dynastic potential, and a marriage to her would enable Sejanus to join the imperial family. At this point, i.e. immediately after Tacitus mentioned Livia's adultery with Sejanus, Tacitus allows Eudemus to play his role. He is introduced with the designation amicus ac medicus in the role of personal physician, who not only had access to the body, but also to the princess's secret thoughts. Livia, the princess of high nobility, commits adultery with the low-ranking man Sejanus. That's the 3rd line on the handout of this passage. Municipali adultero, a municipal adulterer, thus risking her high position and reputation. Also, her relationship with her friend and physician Eudemus, probably a freedman, distances her from the imperial family. In his function as a physician, the translation of specie artis is under the show of his skill, he had frequent and unhindered access to the emperor's daughter-in-law and thus also to her secrets, frequens secretis. Whether the term amicus, as for male amicitia relationships, merely alludes to this special position of trust, or, as the older Pliny reports, to a sexual relationship, and thus to a double adultery with Sejanus and the physician, is left open by Tacitus's briefly formulated statement. In any case, Livia's closeness to the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Sejanus, and the physician makes her appear as a traitor to her noble status and the associated obligation to the dynastic interest of the imperial house as the mother of the emperor's grandchildren. The physician appears in Tacitus' text as somebody in the know about the adultery with Sejanus, and thus at least as an accomplice to his patient Livia. But here too Tacitus not only leaves open the question of whether Livia informed Eudemus also about the plans to murder her husband, but also whether Eudemus was involved in the subsequent actual murder in his capacity and with the possibilities of the personal physician in Drusus's household. The assassination of Drusus is only mentioned after a series of other events. When Drusus complained more frequently and violently about Sejanus' position of power at court, and this was betrayed to Sejanus by, among others, Livia, Sejanus had him poisoned. The poison, which was slow-acting and thus intended to create the impression of an accidental illness, had been administered to him by the eunuch di Spado Lictus. The course of the crime, Ordo Sceleris, was later, 8 years later, disclosed by the torturing of Lictus and Eudemus. That's in chapter 11 of book 4. There Eudemus is mentioned again, and he's never mentioned again after that. From Tacitus's information, it is apparently to be inferred that both Greeks, the eunuch Lictus and the physician Eudemus, were involved in the poisoning and were therefore accused and forced to confess. It can therefore be concluded that Eudemus produced the poison and made it available to his patron Livia, who handed it over to Lictus in the service of Sejanus. According to Tacitus's account, Sejanus thus gained access to Drusus's body, albeit indirectly, not only through his adultery with Drusus's wife Livia, but also through her personal physician. Only the doctor had the skills and means to make the death appear to be the result of a prolonged illness and thus conceal the murder, so that the members of the imperial family and the prefect Sejanus could remain blameless to the outside world, or at least unpunished by Tiberius. He did not allow any accusations to be made against his favorite Sejanus at that point. Reports of the early death of members of the imperial family by poisoning are not uncommon in ancient literature, and each contains similar elements. Suetonius and Dio Cassius also report the poisoning of Drusus by Livia and Sejanus, but without mentioning a physician. In any case, modern research is skeptical. So why does Tacitus assign a physician a role in the theater of power? My answer is Tacitus thus can make it clear that all exponents of power have their Achilles heel precisely at the point where the imperial house grants physicians and their expertise some degree of physical proximity, also via third parties, Livia and Sejanus, even without direct interaction between physician and homicide victim. Tacitus's account of Tiberius's death paints a similar picture of distance and closeness in relation to a physician, and that's item number 4 on page 2 of the handout, this long passage. Shortly before this passage, in the context of the question of a possible successor, and after a diagnosis of the 78-year-old emperor's state of health, Tacitus had referred to Tiberius' skeptical and also mockingly contemptuous attitude towards the medicorum artes. And that was in chapter 46 of book 6, that was item number 1. The scene now of Tacitus' death, in chapter 50, is preceded, in paragraph 1 of that chapter, by a renewed diagnosis of his deteriorating state of health. With his well-known art of disguise, Tiberius tried to cover up the decline in his strength, frequently changing locations and then taking up residence in Misenum, in the villa that had once belonged to Lucullus. That's still paragraph 1. Right at the beginning of the following episode, Tacitus announces that Tiberius had only a few hours to live on this day, that is March 16, AD 37. And this information is confirmed by the scene described in the text, paragraphs 2 to 5. The scene of Tiberius's last appearance, and what interests us here, the brief but carefully staged interaction with the doctor can be imagined as follows. In the villa of the famous gourmand Lucullus, Tiberius, as we learn in the course of the narrative, is at the banquet, i.e. apparently in the triclinium, at table, paragraph 3. Only the doctor Charicles, the new prefect Macro, and Caligula are mentioned by name as table companions. There is also talk of other people present, paragraph 4, presentes, at the beginning. It is interesting that Charicles, introduced with erat as the story opening, is named first and presented with the predicate medicus arte insignis. Despite his apparently technical designation as a distinguished physician, which sounds like a gloss of his name, Charicles, we have no other testimonies to his person apart from the parallel tradition in Suetonius' Life of Tiberius, chapter 72, where only his name is mentioned. Nevertheless, Tacitus gives him a prominent appearance through the position of the verb at the beginning of the sentence, the storytelling formula, the erat formula, as the literary critics say, erat in quadam civitate, so once upon a time, as well as through the predicate insignis and the mention of his name emphasized by nomine. However, we also learn straight away that he was not part of the emperor's company to take charge of the princeps' bouts of ill health. In Latin, it's he was not part of the to regere valetudines principis, but rather to afford the opportunity of advice. Charicles is not Tiberius's personal physician, but his advisor on request. Solitus copiam praebere, in which matters is not stated, but the profession suggests medical advice. In any case, this role as an advisor explains his presence at the emperor's symposium and therefore in the triclinium. Thus, in keeping with Tiberius' skeptical attitude towards doctors, Charicles cannot have precise knowledge of the emperor's state of health, as he does not have access to his body, but he does have the competence to diagnose it by merely touching the emperor's wrist, as we see in the text. In order to gain access to the emperor's wrist, he has to resort to a ruse. He pretends that his own business is calling him to leave prematurely. Paragraph 2, velut propria ad negotia digrediens. In view of his profession as a doctor, which may involve an emergency, this seems plausible. He takes Tiberius' hand in a farewell greeting, but only as a pretense per speciem officii, in show of respect. The grip on his hand and pulse, manum complexus pulsum attigi, disguised as a gesture of reverence, officium, is intended, as we learn later, to predict the emperor's life expectancy, paragraph 3. As a physician, Pericles is familiar with the ancient pulse lore and knows what conclusions can be drawn from a patient's pulse rate, as the findings of the ancient research de pulsibus had been known since Hellenistic times. However, Pericles is unable to deceive Tiberius, and the emperor exposes Pericles' misuse of the traditional Roman social gesture of greeting. Tiberius allows the meal to continue. Only here does it become clear that Pericles was present as a dinner guest, a reaction that can be interpreted as an expression of offense. That's paragraph 3, incertum an offensus. But the fact that he stays at the table longer than usual, on the other hand, is to be interpreted as a sign of deference to his friend, quasi honori abeuntis amici. And apparently he was therefore able to force Pericles to stay longer. He didn't let him go to his patients, even if it was an emergency, but he detected his ruse, so he said, you stay here. Pericles' position and function in the emperor's entourage are difficult to reconstruct from Tacitus' sketchy remarks. As a famous Greek physician, he certainly had the social status of a freedman or even a freeborn peregrine. Although he is explicitly referred to as the emperor's amicus, to whom Tiberius apparently pays homage by extending the duration of the banquet, Tacitus stages this as a pose in paragraph 3. On the basis of this scene, Pericles has been counted by modern historians among the imperial convictores, those who live with the emperor, or even the consilium principis. According to Tacitus, however, Tiberius only used him occasionally as a medical advisor. This information seems to explain why Tiberius, who, as Tacitus had mentioned shortly before, was skeptical of doctors, allowed Pericles to attend the banquet at all. Pericles apparently had access to the imperial rooms, at least to the triclinium, not as a personal physician, but in the role of an occasional advisor. He now abuses this privilege by touching Tiberius as a doctor without the patient's consent. Tacitus's following remarks give the impression that Tiberius could also have had other reasons for not wanting Pericles close to him as his personal physician. For, as we learn, Pericles, still present in the triclinium, turned to the prefect Macro and assured him, firmavit, that Tiberius, I quote, arterial air was faltering and would not last beyond 2 days. Paragraph 3, labi spiritum nec ultra viduum duraturem. The reaction is immediate, paragraph 4. Those present, the presentes, confer. Messengers are sent to the legates and the armies, apparently with the message that the emperor will die in 2 days, and the new emperor Caligula will then, in 2 days, take power. But at the moment when Tiberius's breathing stops, and it is thought that, contrary to Pericles' prediction, he died on that day, the date, March 16, is specifically mentioned, Caligula is congratulated by a large crowd of people present in the villa. But when Caligula, according to the usual script, which was apparently also valid outside Rome, wants to leave the house to present himself to the public as the new emperor, he is stopped by the news that Tiberius's voice and sight have been restored and that he wants food. So the emperor wants to continue the banquet a second time after this new interruption. In the panic that now breaks out of fear of Tiberius's anger, in which everyone else leaves the room, feigning grief and cluelessness, Caligula remains silent and frozen in anticipation of the worst. Macro, on the other hand, keeps a cool head and has the emperor suffocated with blankets. Paragraph 5. Thus ends the banquet, and after its repeated continuation, Tiberius's life in the dining room of Lucullus's villa. In this dramatic scene, which Tacitus narrates in a way that can be easily imagined on stage or in a film, Charicles is no longer mentioned. He is visible as an actor in the text until the moment when he informs Macro of the diagnosis, which causes the announcement of the transfer of the power in 2 days. Charicles had thus been able to make his diagnosis and prognosis about Tiberius' condition of life expectancy despite his negative reaction. By taking his pulse, Charicles was able to determine, as he tells Macro, that Tiberius' spiritus, now we have to look close at the text, was faltering. Here Tacitus, as we can say, on the basis of a shorter note by William Oldfather in the year from 1939, it's in the bibliography, Tacitus puts medical expertise into the doctor's mouth by referring to the state of the spiritus. According to some specialists in ancient physiology, air, pneuma, translated here as spiritus, was also transported in the blood vessels, specifically in the arteries. So when Charicles feels or is monitoring the pulse, paragraph 2, pulsum venarum, he can tell how strong or already weak the arterial air in Tiberius' arteries is. I quote from Oldfather: "If therefore, according to the doctrine of Herophilus and Erasistratus, followed by the Stoics, Simon Magus and others, the arteries carried pneuma alone or pneuma along with small quantities of blood. If this is true, then what the holders of this view thought they were testing when they felt the so-called pulse must have been a spurt or puff of pneuma spiritus, and there can be little doubt that this is the view to which Tacitus, in the present passage, at least as far as the form of expression is concerned, subscribed." End of quote. Charicles' statement about Tiberius' spiritus, therefore, does not refer to the breath coming out of his nose and or mouth. For Charicles would have been able to perceive the intensity of breathing through the nose or mouth without reaching the pulse. The emperor's breath only stops during the continued banquet, so much so that those present think he is already dead. Paragraph 4, interclusa anima creditus est mortalitatem explevisse. Spiritus is not the same as anima, but spiritus is a medical terminus technicus that refers to the air that can be felt in the pulse, which indirectly indicates the vitality of the patient. The pulse is an important indicator for ancient diagnostics, not least because compared to other examination practices, it enabled uncomplicated and rapid access from the outside to an internal bodily activity. However, and now I quote from Orly Lewis's article, it entails more than a mere flittering brush of the fingers over the patient's wrist. It involved rather the application of a static pressure for the duration of at least 10 beats. So it was a long handshaking that Eudemus obtained from Tiberius. In any case, the grip on the wrist is a conspicuous gesture that the doctor could hardly have carried out unnoticed. It therefore seems plausible that in the scene described by Tacitus, Tiberius recognized Charicles' action as an attempt at a medical diagnosis, not least because Tiberius was regarded as an educated monarch interested in Hellenistic expertise, who must have known about the pulse lore. Charicles is thus modeled by Tacitus as a competent doctor who demonstrates his professional authority by reaching for the pulse, even if in Tacitus' scenic depiction he had underestimated the old emperor's knowledge and didn't expect this revealing action. Charicles was not wrong in his diagnosis, even if it initially seemed to be refuted by the emperor's fainting spell, which was interpreted as death after he stopped breathing. Whether Tiberius would have been able to live for the 2 days predicted by Charicles remains an open question. In front of Macro and Caligula, who in Tacitus' account can be considered his patrons, he could at any rate appear to be as competent a physician as his speaking name, Charicles, and Tacitus' reference to his outstanding reputation suggest. For the readers, so that was for Macro and Caligula, and now for the readers of Tacitus' text, for us, the external audience in this theater of power, the misuse of the honorific gesture of greeting as a medical diagnosis in the service of the power-hungry and impatient schemers Caligula and Macro, and also from a medico-legal perspective against the patient's consent, must appear reprehensible. In Charicles' defense, it can at least be noted that he did not allow himself to be drawn into a murder plot against the emperor by Macro and Caligula, and thus did not act as a poisoner. The obviously unplanned murder of Tiberius should be blamed solely on Macro's spontaneous reaction. Tacitus' account leads to the cynical conclusion that if the two had relied on Charicles' prediction that Tiberius would only live for a short time, if they had therefore not committed the emperor's murder, the doctor's role would appear rather harmless. But in Tacitus' narrative, Charicles abuses his obvious expertise and undermines his authority and excellent reputation as a physician by becoming involved in the script of intrigue and corruption that is gaining importance in the Julio-Claudian court. The physician thus appears, like other players in the emperor's entourage, as a figure on the playing field or in the theater of power, a figure which can be used for political intrigue and crime. In Tacitus' depiction, he serves as a sign of the corruption of the rulers, medically speaking, as a symptom of a disease, moral decay, and the decline of political culture. The cause of the sick state is not the socially inferior doctor who violates the professional rules, but those who abuse his competence in order to come to power. Caligula member of the imperial family, and the prefect Macro, whose position after Sejanus' fall again appears to be the key factor for regulating the balance of power at the imperial court. So the social inferior people. One last death. Tacitus' account of Claudius's death in Annals, Book 12, chapter 66, following, then reads like the proof of, well, I just skipped this passage, so I have to go to tell you something more, a hypothesis of mine. The role of the two physicians at Tiberius' court, or in his entourage, who are each instrumentalized for intrigues to undermine the emperor's power, also allows Tacitus to illustrate Tiberius' own weakness. He is regarded as a mentally, and after apparently being in good health for a long time, then also physically weak emperor. Nevertheless, at the age of 76, he had reached a respectable age by ancient standards and ruled for a good 22 years from August 14 to March 37. So, did Tiberius' skeptical attitude towards medical help, as attested in several sources, which meant that he did not want to allow the doctors to enter his most intimate rooms and thus did not want to allow the possibility of his health being manipulated. So, did this skepticism ultimately lead to a prolongation of his life? Question mark. Now Tacitus' account of Claudius' death in Annales Book 12 then reads like a proof of this not entirely serious thesis of mine. Although Claudius showered with honors his personal physician Gaius Stertinius Xenophon, who had accompanied him on his campaign to Britain in 43 and cured him of a serious illness 10 years later, 53. Claudius was killed the following year, 54, by his very physician, as Tacitus relates with reference to the writers of that time. When Claudius vomited, you all know this story. When he vomited the mushroom dish laced with poison by Locusta, Agrippina called in the physician Xenophon, Claudius's Leibarzt, she had previously initiated, to assist the emperor in vomiting by sticking a feather down his throat, and the feather was coated with an immediately effective, i.e. apparently specially prepared poison. In contrast to Tiberius, Claudius granted this physician, with whom he was apparently on friendly terms, access to his body. And this, at least according to Tacitus, proved to be his fatal undoing, because his opponents, especially his wife, were able to exploit precisely this trust between doctor and patient. One might say that Tacitus drew on the literary top boy of physicians as poisoners and their instrumentalization by members of the imperial family. And therefore, Tacitus' modeling of Xenophon, who was demonstrably and verifiably loyal to the emperor, has been doubted by the historians. However, the pattern of the staging of all three accounts of the death remains interesting. The figure of the doctor serves as a trigger, so to speak, to portray the emperor's entourage as scheming and power-hungry. Only one doctor another one, is given a positive connotation in Tacitian death scene, and that is Seneca's personal physician Statius Aeneas in Annales book 15. At least in Tacitus's account, Tiberius was not killed by a doctoral poison attack, but by brute force. So now I come to the conclusion: he was spared the fate of Joseph Stalin. In the months before his death, some of the most respected and well-known Jewish doctors in the USSR had been accused of being involved in a medical conspiracy aimed at poisoning the top Soviet political and military leadership. Thus, at the age of 74, after a dinner and drinking session with his confidants, Stalin died of a stroke all alone in his room, where he was found dead on the morning of March 1st, 1953. After Stalin's death, the doctors were rehabilitated. As can be seen at least from Claudius's tributes and homage to Gaius Tertullius Xenophon, Tiberius's skeptical attitude towards personal physicians did not prevail either. The importance and prestige of physicians in Rome and Moscow subsequently grew unabated, as in Rome the example of Galen makes clear. However, an author like Tacitus would probably answer the question of whether the imperial personal physicians continued to abuse their access to the rooms and bodies of power in the affirmative, because in Tacitus's senatorial view, power itself turns toxic. Thank you.
Grazie Terese per questa estremamente interessante relazione che ci che fa concentrare sull'importanza del contesto sociale, culturale, politico dell'attività dei medici, ma degli scienziati anche in generale, se vogliamo, a Roma, nella Roma imperiale. Io ho anche qualche cosa da chiederti, ma prima volevo sapere se c'è qualcuno che vuole fare domande. Domande possiamo farle in inglese, in tedesco naturalmente, in italiano anche, parlando lentamente, quindi se c'è qualcuno che vuole intervenire, o in francese,
Sì.
Se c'è qualcuno che vuole intervenire. A voi la parola. Altrimenti chiedo io intanto.
Prego.
Una cosa. Tu più volte hai sottolineato lo status sociale basso dei medici. Che cosa possiamo dire? Possiamo dire qualcosa sul fatto che i medici a Roma normalmente erano immigrati ed erano greci, e che il ruolo, la professione del medico non era considerata una professione degna di un cittadino romano fino ad un certo momento, diciamo così, della storia. C'è qualcosa che si può dire su questo? Il fatto che gli imperatori anche, come in questo caso, avessero quasi timore anche del medico, avessero un rapporto difficile con il medico, può avere a che fare anche con il fatto che i medici erano appunto tutti o quasi tutti stranieri, greci, immigrati appunto di classi sociali spesso anche basse. Galeno è un po' un'eccezione forse in tutto questo, sì, in questo panorama.
Questa è una domanda che eccede la mia competenza, ma ci sono due studi forse conosci, certo, Corbela Kudlin. Medizin, Personal im antiken Rom, eine sozialgeschichtliche Untersuchung, die Stellung des Arztes in der römischen Gesellschaft, Freigeborene, Eingebürgerte, Peregrine, Sklaven. And they collect all the material and they can find only few exceptions that the, physicians were given citizenship. And Xenophon is one of the examples. And he even let Claudius give citizenship to his family in Kos. So this means it's like other freedmen who had a very important role at the court of the emperors, but were not allowed to be elected in political offices, positions. So it takes a while that even strangers can gain citizenship, as you know, 3rd century. But I mean, what my point is, in spite of that, they had much closer access to the emperor's rooms, the spatia luoghi. And this is something that Tacitus also shows with other freedmen. They were rich, influential, they were not involved in political power, but indirect power. And so the physicians are, these few physicians that are mentioned in Tacitus' Annales are more examples to that the emperors did give power away, not political power, but personal power. I mean, I often use the example of the German chancellor, who has a big staff of advisors who are not elected democratically, but they are more influential. Or the president of our university, he has his advisors, and we have nothing to do with them, but they tell him you should do that, because they have expertise. So the power of the expertise, that's something that in the case of the physicians is important for Tacitus, not political power. And as I called it, it's the Achilles first, heel, Achilles ferse di Achilles heels, come si dice in italiano?
Il tallone.
Il tallone, sì, di Achille, where they could be even killed by this person. So power and social status and or political power and social status, as Tacitus shows, have nothing to do with actual power. And there is a master thesis of an American who wrote about this role of the physicians, and he says Tacitus is xenophobe. I don't believe in this. I mean, whether they are strangers, Greeks, they are Greeks because Hellenistic science is that much in advance to the Roman search. That's something they let the Greeks or Egyptians do. And did not do themselves because they thought, I mean, it's a sort of delegation of science to foreigners. But it's not a xenophobia, it's just a way of instrumentalizing the science and the competence, the expertise of someone else.
Yeah, maybe that's also something to do with dealing with the sick human body is not as attractive as other domains. Yeah. I mean, having to do with blood and all that the sick human body entails. So there's also to do with this image of the doctor.
It's a good point. That's for inferior, socially inferior people. But at the same time, they have the power to access the body.
Of course. Ambra, prego.
I have a question regarding Eudemus' role in Tacitus' testimony, especially this his possible involvement in this adultery relationship with Livia, or his involvement in her murderous projects. I was wondering if this figure, the figure of Eudemus as a doctor who has access to her secret thoughts, as you said, is also functional to Tacitus' intentional negative representation of Livia, because I mean, as far as I know, it's pretty common among like Roman historians, the negative representation of powerful female figures. For example, Faustina Minor, her very known fertility is suspected to be connected to some adulterous facts or something. So she's also misrepresented by historians. So I was wondering if it's the same case, or do you think that the figure of Eudemus as a physician is in a certain way functional to this purpose, for at least to this intention of Tacitus, if this intention is real in Tacitus' purpose?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a good point. I wouldn't say that Tacitus is misogynist. You didn't say that either. Yeah. But I mean, as other schemes or other patterns, that there is a doctor and poison involved in the death of members of the imperial family, this could be another pattern that. I mean, Drusus is the prince and he has children. He's the most, the best man to success Tiberius, and he has his Achilles heel is Livia, who has a personal physician. So it's the intermediate actor Livia who has the physician who gives access to her husband's body. So it's again a figure who does not have the possibility to have political power. No female actress as Agrippina. I mean, she wants to, but she is killed after that. And so Livia too shows in Tacitus' choreography that there are other possibilities to gain access to power and to manipulate this imperial system. And it's a good point that Tacitus models her as such a figure. I mean, I'm not a historian, I'm a literary critic, so I can say I'm interested in what the author does, and the historians would be interested in the reality. And I don't know whether, I mean, most historians say Tacitus just manipulates the information. And I say, oh, great, he does. But to show something that is historically relevant, that in this system of power and political system of power, there are means also by the female actors to gain power. I mean, she doesn't do it for herself, but for Sejanus, who is one who cannot be elected for an important, or he cannot become member of the imperial family, but this would be the way, that's what Tacitus often says, that's his way of gaining access to the imperial family, even if he is not related, to marry her. But of course this wouldn't be a match, a real match. But there are means. And it's interesting in this pattern that there is a physician and a woman.
So do you think we can say that in this case the figure of the physician is somehow a sort of narrative tool that Tacitus uses for his purpose as an author?
I mean, that's what the historians tend to say. I mean, Tony Woodman, who not only wrote about books 5 and 6, but also on book 4 of the Annals. And he is sort of a mixture between historian and philologist, literary critic. And he says, well, the historians say this is all invented by Tacitus. But who knows? I mean, we do not have any evidence about Eudemus's role at the imperial court. And as I said, about Charicles, we don't know anything. But we have so scarce, so few sources.
Yeah, but all Roman historians are suspected of having manipulated and invented, and this is said of everybody.
Yeah.
And sometimes this is perhaps even too much. This kind of
the skepticism.
Skepticism. Yeah, so, una domanda qui, prego.
I will give a resume in English, but it's easier for me to ask
Oui.
first in German.
German,
French.
Ja, ist egal, es macht mir auch Training. Ja. Ich fand das alles sehr überzeugend, aber ich bin gerade nicht ein Literaturkritiker, ich bin ein Historiker. Ja? Und ich habe dann eine Nebenfrage, die nicht direkt mit den Chirurgen oder mit den Ärzten zu tun hat. Das ist eher der Tod des Tiberius. Tacitus hat eine exzellente Dokumentation und sie wurde ja auch 4 oder 5 Mal durch epigraphische Funde bestätigt. Aber manchmal hat man doch den Eindruck, dass es rhetorische Erfindungen oder Zusätze gibt. Und das ist gerade vielleicht der Tod des Tiberius selbst, denn die Leute, die in der Zeit des Todes des Tiberius gelebt hatten, nämlich Philo und einer der beiden Seneca, sagen, dass man ihn einfach tot auf dem Boden gefunden hat und dass er nicht erwürgt oder erstickt wurde. Ja. Könnte das ein rhetorischer Zusatz von der Generation zwischen Seneca und Tacitus sein, um zu zeigen, dass Tiberius den Tod gehabt hat, den er verdient hat, sozusagen, weil er in den letzten Jahren ein schlechter Kaiser war. So we know Tacitus has an excellent documentation, but is it possible that the death of Tiberius is a rhetorical construction because of his bad lost years of governance of the Roman Empire? Haben Sie eine Meinung darüber? What's your opinion?
I mean, this is the same as we discussed before. I mean, it's excellent drama. They didn't want to kill him. They could have waited for 2 days, but then he seemed to be dead. And then they reacted in a way that Tiberius couldn't accept. So they had the fear that he would have consequences against Caligula and Macro. So they killed him. It's a great story. And you can say this is invented because Tacitus wants to say after, 22 years of government, that's a long time. I mean, that's longer than, not than Augustus, but than Claudius and Caligula and the following, even Nero. That's a long time. And then this short death. And you would say, you could interpret this as a comment on Tacitus' side. Yeah. But do we know whether Tacitus didn't have access to sources that were not accessible to Seneca and whom did you mention? Philo?
Yeah, Philo, the Jude,
Yeah.
But he was in Roma, Philo, in the 2 years after the death of Tiberius. So perhaps we never have the real answer, but
but I mean, Tiberius.
But I have the impression that with the time they have had this episode of
suffocating.
Suffocating.
Yeah. But I mean, Philo was Jewish coming to the Romans, and Tacitus was senator, close to the emperors. we just don't know. But in any case, it is a great scene, and I mean, your point is very good for Tacitus to make a point. This emperor deserves such a actually unspectacular death, just because of a misunderstanding or because the anima was faltering, the spiritus was faltering, and then the anima.
Okay.
And I think the role of Charicles is dramatized in a very impressive way. He was right, and he was not involved in a murder. There was no murder plan, murder of homicide.
C'era una domanda anche, sì, prego.
Thank you very much for your lecture, which was very interesting to me. I have a question and the short quote about the status of the doctor. The short quote is from the Book of Splendor, in which there is a sentence that says that all physicians are in hell because the true hell is the human body. Therefore, it's definitely a job which is very desirable in that tradition, and in the Kabbalistic tradition. And the question is concerning the attitude of Tiberius towards medicine, and my attention was drawn in particular by the first 2 points of your handout. So in the first one, we read that a man after the age of 30 shouldn't require someone else's advice and so on. In the second one, it talks about a man who is over 60 and becomes ridiculous if he holds the hand to a physician. So I wanted to ask you, what is the difference between these two numbers, 30 and 60? Because in the first one, it seems to me like he's saying after the age of 30, actually some illnesses may occur, but then Tiberius' position is, apart from being skeptic, is that one should be able to take care of his own body. And that it may be expressed by this dichotomy corpori suo alieni consili, which is quite strong. And in the second one, is somehow, if I understand correctly, he's saying after the age of 60, these illnesses should not be understood as pathological conditions, but it's just normal in a way. It's just the age going by, therefore it may be ridiculous to refer to a doctor. So I wanted to ask you if this attitude reveals somehow a strong difference among the ancient attitude towards medicine and our modern attitude towards medicine. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, because I mean those passages are just referred to when they say Tiberius was skeptical against physicians. And this question of the age, I interpret it as you do, that in Tacitus' passage it says when you are an adult you should be able to take care of your own body and not let it be taken care by another one. I mean, the age of 30, I would say at the age of 15 or 20, it's still a high age. And in Plutarch, the two passages I just referred to, the other ones, they are, I'm nothing against Plutarch, and it depends on what argument he wants to use, and they are in, what's the title of these two? It's De Tuenda Sanitate Praecepta, and the other one is something about whether you should take power in an old age. And then, which means over the age of 6, I mean, I'm not talking about modern politicians who are over 80. And Tiberius was over 70 when he died, like Stalin. I mean, about the same age. It's interesting. So, which the point would be, I don't know about anything about Kabbalistic medicine, but the point would be you can rule if you are in a good health and don't give you power to inferior people by Cheira, proteinon, Cheira. It's exactly what Tiberius is doing in Tacitus's passage. But just for greeting. And if you do it for giving it to a doctor to feel your pulse, this must be something, as you said, these inferior people have access to the body to take care of, and if you are, Plutarch's point would be, if you have reached, as I guess you interpreted, if you have reached a certain age, don't care.
Okay.
But I mean, 60 is not that old.
For us.
Even in ancient, I mean, the ancient, you usually say you are a senex from the age of, what is it, 40? But there are many senes who were in the position of power. And the Tiberius is a good example.
Ambra, c'è ancora qualcosa?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about his question and your answer. I was wondering if Tiberius' skepticism towards medicine in general, towards physicians, Greek physicians, and the fact that he thought that an adult should take care of his own body by himself. If maybe this is connected to his attachment, preference for traditional Roman medicine,
Mm-hmm.
which was always, like practiced in a domestic context,
Mm-hmm.
without like a real physician, like intervening and being in charge.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there is a sort of, reference to the traditional Roman way to approach healing and medicine.
I mean, the argument has been brought up. It's like the old Cato who said the pater familias should take care, and you don't need those Greeks and Egyptians. But on the other hand, Tiberius did have a big staff of astrologers and Hellenistic scientists around himself. So it's actually the exception that he didn't have a physician in this staff, in this scientific staff. The astrologer, Thrasyllus, had a very close proximity to him, but not the physician. And this is, I would say, it's not that Roman tradition, but it's the knowledge that these physicians do have power over your body.
So the perspective is more political.
More anthropological. And I mean, the example referred to by Scribonius, which I brought, he did let the slave cook him that medicine according to a recipe by Cassius, and give it to him. His slave, the slave wouldn't, I mean, if you buy the slave, you can make him a murderer, a homicide, but the slave was obviously so dependent from him, more dependent than a physician who had his social status. And he let the slave, Archimetus, to do this for him, to cook the medicine. And then he gave the slave to Cassius. That's an interesting story. And there the historians would say it must be true, because Scribonius says where he got the recipe from. And I would rather say this was the knowledge that physicians did have power. Tiberius was, I mean, he was old, sometimes a bit silly, but he was clever. So he knew, this is my Achilles heel.
Tallone di Achille.
Sì.
Thank you.
Se non ci sono altre domande, direi che possiamo essere soddisfatti. Abbiamo una pausa, abbiamo un lunch, diciamo, offerto Dall'organizzazione dov'è Ambra? Qui o
Sempre al solito posto, al di là
dopo il ponte, dopo il
dopo
passaggio, sì.
sì.
E quindi riprendiamo poi alle 2 i lavori. Grazie a tutti.
Ci voleva una copertura.
Lei mi chiede quando lo dico?
Sì,
No, assolutamente. Era
una qualità.
era là, così come era. No, non era assolutamente quella, no.